Welcome to today's Bite-Size PD titled 2E 101, A Quick Introduction to Twice Exceptional Learners. My name is Hallie Kirk. I'm our SALTA Gifted and Talented Specialist and our Elementary Social Studies Specialist. Formerly taught middle school ELA and Social Studies as well as 5th grade in the SALTA program. I'm also on our information literacy team as well as our assessment team. All right, so our goals for today's session, I'm going to give you some background and terminology for twice exceptionality. You will understand some characteristics of twice exceptional learners. We will broadly examine some aspects of neurodiversity and then give you some ideas for where to begin with supporting twice exceptional learners. All right, before we begin, I'd like you to just develop your own working definition of what twice exceptional means as you currently understand it. So go ahead and just pause. You can jot it down or type it on a note, but just give yourself a little bit of a place to start when we say twice exceptional. What does that mean to you? All right. So our definition for today comes from Emily Kircher-Morris, who's an expert in the field. And basically it comes down to twice exceptional, meaning students with cognitive giftedness and also a disability. So we're going to back up a little bit and talk about each of these two components. So if we think about gifted programs in the United States typically have historically served our students with high IQs, students with advanced cognition, and students who are high achieving. So these would be students who can have their needs met through classroom differentiation or options like AP and honors at the secondary level. So typically the way these programs are structured are designed to identify students with both of these characteristics and develop a program model to service them. On the other end of that same spectrum, we have special education programs. And in the United States, conversely, this typically is designed to serve students with lower cognitive ability compared to their peers, or students who struggle to have their needs met through typical differentiation in a general education setting. So kind of the opposite of what our gifted programs have historically served. But this creates a few issues. One being, what does this mean when we have students who are high cognitive ability but struggle with achievement and need additional specialized supports in their classrooms? And what does this mean for students who maybe do struggle with some cognitive processes but also do really well in school and tend to be just fine without having to have a lot of additional supports? So just some food for thought. Isn't this just general education? Don't we see this in every educational setting at some point? So right now, as it stands, students, as they're referred for special ed, they're rarely referred for gifted testing at the same time. However, SPED programs are becoming gradually more aware of 2E learners nationally, and students that are labeled as gifted are rarely screened for learning disabilities. So this creates kind of a paradox where we have an ability that masks a disability or a disability that masks an ability. And in more and more places around the country, we're starting to see special education and gifted education sort of merge. Sometimes it's called multi-exceptionalities. There's a whole bunch of different terminology for these types of programs. But essentially, we're saying that these are students who have needs in the classroom that are specialized, that they will need additional supports to be successful. So, cognitive giftedness and disability, you also might come across the term 3E or multi-exceptional, and that's another component where we've got students with cognitive giftedness, disability, and perhaps culturally, linguistically diverse, multilingual, or economically disadvantaged. So a few different aspects that play into their access in terms of education. So when we talk about cognitive giftedness, what does that mean? So this means students who have above average cognitive ability. So this would be measured by things like IQ tests. There are cognitive ability tests, but This is measuring thinking processes, so pattern recognition, being able to look at problems in a novel way. So it's not necessarily achievement, what students already know or what they've learned. It's more impacted by how their brains are wired to solve problems and approach learning. And this just by definition is a form of neurodivergence. So, neurodivergent meaning their neural processes are outside of the neuronormative range. So, moving from here, we also have our disabilities, and these are the ones as determined by IDEA legislation in 2023. So these are the ones that are recognized in our school systems. So 2E students would be students in that upper echelon of the bell curve in terms of cognitive ability, and also have one of these disabilities here. And to sort of zoom in on that, these are the ones that are most common in school-age kids that we do see. So specific learning disability by far is the most common one. But you can kind of take a look at that, and that's from the same year from the Department of Ed in 2023. So when we think about disability, sometimes we think of a spectrum as being linear. So traditionally, we've thought maybe autism was you were either less autistic or more autistic. When in reality, it's not so much of a linear spectrum. It is more of a web. So when we have something like autism spectrum disorder, we have these 6 different facets that all kind of coexist together to manifest in an ASD diagnosis. So this would be like you might have struggles with social awareness. You might have routine or repetitive behaviors, sensory sensitivities, intense focus and interests, motor skills, and communication abilities. These are all indications of an individual with autism spectrum disorder, but it's going to show up in different ways for different people. So if you look at these webs as you move toward the outside, that's more stronger presenting. And in the inside of the circle, it is less of a stronger presenting characteristic. So this particular person with autism spectrum disorder really has high social awareness, but high intense focus and needs, those monotropisms where they're really focused on the things that they're interested in about. But they're not as high in these motor skills. They maybe struggle with some of the motor skills, or they struggle with some of the communication abilities, sensory sensitivities. So this is going to vary depending on the individual. So it's the same thing with cognitive giftedness. It's not about being more or less gifted. It's that there are these common characteristics, these 6 right here, that are indications of high cognitive ability. And you might have a student with really, really high creativity, but their verbal ability maybe isn't off the charts. But by having all of these things in that top 5th percentile, or 95th percentile, top 5%, we have a portrait of what a cognitively gifted individual might look like. And then over here on the right, these are some characteristics of gifted learners. So rapid learning and comprehension, intensely observant and curious, the ability to explore topics in significant depth, divergent and creative thought processes, heightened sensory sensitivities, and strong working memory. And you might notice that some of those are what we just talked about in the autism spectrum disorder slide. So there is a lot of overlap here, which is why we do see a lot of twice exceptional learners who are highly gifted in terms of their cognitive ability, but maybe do have some additional disabilities or other factors that kind of interplay in terms of how we support them in the classroom. So 2E learners are students with cognitive giftedness and disability, and both of these are brain processes that deviate from what is measured as our norm. So both of these then would be considered neurodivergent. So there are a lot of different types of neurodiversity. These are some common ones. We've got ADHD, autism, cognitive giftedness itself as a neurodiversity indicator. Dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, epilepsy, and Tourette's are all considered neurodiverse. Then you have some more mental health diagnosis, which really aren't considered they aren't really considered as neurodiverse because they can be a lot more situational. So generalized anxiety, major depression, social anxiety, anorexia, bulimia, these can be definitely, serious diagnoses that do impact how students how students receive support in the classroom, how they learn at school, but they're not necessarily considered neurodiversity because they can be, they can come and go throughout your lifetime. They're not things that generally are going to impact you your whole life. And then there are a few different disorders here that are kind of a little bit of both. So just something to kind of think about. So when we talk about neurodiversity, it can be influenced by many factors. It's complex. So these could be things like genetic variations. People are just born with certain wiring, and that's the way that their brain develops, and that's just how their connectivity, how they're wired. Environmental factors, so things like trauma, exposure to toxins, malnutrition at early ages, developmentally, those could all be factors that may make one of these neurodiversity, one of these forms of neurodiversity more or less present in an individual. You've got your epistemic marginalization, so things like access to resources, being able to have access to education and to knowledge and a support network. And then you've also got emotional regulation challenges. So stress, episodic anxiety, lack of social support, any of these things are going to impact the way that neurodiversity is influenced. So if you think about something like ADHD, for example, it's a form of neurodiversity. We know that there are certain things that for an individual with ADHD, it tends to be more about attention regulation, not necessarily that they don't have attention. It's that they have a hard time paying attention and regulating their attention in the ways that they want to, or in a way that would be more common in a neuronormative setting. And so then you've got things like TikTok, for example, where we know that a lot of exposure to that can impact anyone's ability to regulate their own attention. So if you've got an individual who has ADHD that's spending a lot of time on TikTok, that's going to be a factor that would influence how that ADHD is manifesting and showing up in their daily lives. So why are we talking about this? Actually, before we even get into that, I'm going to give you even more background. So the historical context of neurodiversity, this whole neurodiversity movement came about in the 90s and 2000s. Very similar, mirroring trends like the celebrating diversity movements, disability rights movements. And then in 1997, Harvey Bloom is the one who's credited with conceptualizing the term neurodiversity. And he wrote this article here for the New York Times. And it was called Autistics Freed from Face-to-Face Encounters Are Communicating in Cyberspace. And this was kind of a revolutionary article because he basically said, autistics are doing the thing that their disability alleges that they cannot do, that they cannot communicate. So really, is it that autistic individuals struggle with communication, or is it just about more of these environmental ecological factors? And this quote from his article says, "The common assumption in cognitive studies these days is that in the human brain, the occasional bug is inevitable, hence autism and other departures from the neurological norm. Autistics are suggesting another way of looking at this. Neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will prove best at any moment?" And if you're interested in this, there's a fantastic book about the whole history of this and autism, specifically by Steve Silverman. It's called Neurotribes. Highly recommend it. But basically, this whole neurodiversity movement that came about in the early 2000s was just like ecologists speak of biodiversity, that we need a whole bunch of different organisms to have a healthy ecosystem, biodiversity. Neurodiversity is the same sort of thing. And so we should represent that similarly and use it to develop inclusive policy and practices that cultivate neurodiverse individuals thriving. And also kind of begged this question, is disability maybe more societal than an individual problem? So then this movement, it changed a lot of things. One is it discouraged pathologizing behavior. So it sort of shifted away from like, he can't do it because he has ADHD. Rather, we started looking at the environment around the individual and where we could support that person in that specific circumstance. It reclaimed disability to allow for more advocacy work. So, we are labeling students in this case twice exceptional students, but also any of those forms of neurodiversity. Whenever we label students, it's important that we as educators are wary of oversimplifying the intricacies that are embedded within these labels. And as an educator in gifted ed, we're always grappling with these ambiguities. What does gifted actually mean? And so it's not inherently bad or good, but I think that it's always worth considering and kind of stepping back and thinking about, when we're labeling students, what does that mean? And are we using it to allow for more advocacy, or is it becoming marginalized? And then the neurodiversity also centered disabled people more in these inclusive policies and practices, and then it challenged the dominant way of organizing society by segregating autistic individuals and training them to be more normal. So just kind of, it's an interesting thing to consider is the individual disabled by a neuronormative society, or is it the societal conditions that disable the individual? So just some things to think about. So for our classroom, again, our twice exceptional learners are neurodivergent, gifted students are neurodivergent, and disabilities that we listed there would be considered neurodiverse. So this can be really hard to parse out because of all of these nuances we've discussed. So you might have a student, for example, with inattention. So is the student bored because they're not challenged enough? Is it a gifted behavior that they need more of a cognitive challenge? Or is the child having trouble regulating their focus? In that case, it would be something that would be considered more of a disability, with maybe something like ADHD co-occurring. Is the student blurting out answers because they have a quick processing speed and copious knowledge, so is it gifted behavior? Or is the student having executive functioning deficits and response inhibition, which would be a disability behavior? So that impulsivity can go either way. Refusal to write, very common for gifted students, often due to perfectionism. Or is this maybe a learning difficulty in written expression? So is there underlying disability? And then poor social skills. Is the child truly unable to interact socially with peers, or does the child have nothing in common with them because they're gifted and they don't have the same interests? So the social skills, right? So there's a lot of components and nuances. So there is a fantastic tool for you as you're thinking through maybe students you work with or students that you are currently working with, and you look at your own definition from earlier in this session. And this checklist, if you click the link, it will pull up a form, a screener that was developed by these people at the top, but it's also available in Emily Kircher Morris's book. And it goes through a whole bunch of different characteristics of twice exceptional learners, and you can kind of go through and say, okay, is there, are we observing this behavior often, or is it not so much observed? And as you go through that, it should help you kind of decide whether or not there's something here that we need to look a little bit more deeply at in terms of their supports at school. So once we've identified a student who's twice exceptional, what do we do? The kind of gold standard in supporting 2E learners comes from Susan Baum, who is at UConn, University of Connecticut, and she's got a fantastic book called To Be Gifted and Learning Disabled. And essentially it comes down to helping find their strengths and then using those strengths, the strengths-based approach, to help them with challenges that they may have or be experiencing. So building on student strengths and offering accommodations when necessary to support the areas of difficulty. And these are both equally important. There is no one-size-fits-all way to do this. It's going to be different depending on the individual, just like all of those other facets that we examined earlier. And students shouldn't be forced to use a strength-based approach. So that's another thing I think, I hadn't considered as much, as just because they're really good at it doesn't necessarily mean that that is appropriate to be doing all the time. And also, they can burn out. And then strengths-based is not the same thing as interest-based. So you might be a really strong writer, but you're not that interested in writing, right? Those are different things. If you would like more, we've got these few short videos. They're called 5-minute PDs from Emily Kircher Morris. And there's a video and kind of a one-pager to help you think through it. But these are 3 that I think are really helpful for all educators to review. So the first one is on ADHD and some myths around that. Second one is on twice exceptionality, and we'll go a little bit more in depth with what I've started today. And then cognitive giftedness if you're interested in learning more about that. All right. And then if you want to learn even more, there is a book study that I have just created with USBE with Emily Kircher Morris's book called Teaching Twice Exceptional Learners in Today's Classroom. And the Midas course is linked here if you click right on the title. You can also look it up with the Midas code, and it's available for up to 2 USBE credits. And the first come, first serve, they will provide the book for you as well. And then the book is fantastic. I can't recommend it enough. It has all kinds of tools for students of all ages. It goes into more depth with the different disabilities, but it's just a fantastic resource for teachers. And then I will also be presenting more on twice exceptional learners at our Elevated Teaching Summit coming up in June. And there will also be all kinds of fantastic presentations, but I will be doing a session on that there as well. So there's some information there to sign up starting on March 27th. And that is all for today. So please feel free to reach out. If you have any questions, make sure you get your relicensure credit, and have a fantastic day.